But today we're talking to his other area of expertise, which is another slightly dark, oily area like fossil fuels. And that is the far right, not just the far right in the UK, but globally, with a particular emphasis on what's happening in America since Trump took office. And this all comes out of his amazingly timely book that came out with Byline Books, I must say, came out last November, Alt-Right. Before we go on to some of the latest far-right memes and sort of, restrictions, bannings, and persecutions happening now, can you just give our audience who don't know about it a brief outline of your magnum opus, the Alt-Right?
Thanks, Peter. So the Alt-Right is the a book that we published this, as you said, Peter, at the end of last year. Um, as things moved so fast, we actually did an updated edition, which came out uh, in February, updated for the new Trump administration. And the book basically tells the whole story right from the beginning in the 1930s, the 100-year story of how we got here. And that's the question I think, I've often asked myself. I've often had my colleagues ask. We've all asked each other, what the hell is going on? How is this happening? How are we seeing a full frontal war on our democracies? And I think at Byline, we have been detecting the sinews of this. We've been seeing the fissures, we've been seeing the cracks, we've been talking about it for a while. But we've all been taken aback, I think, by the sheer brazenness of this assault on democracy, and really the resurgence of forms of racism and fascism, which we thought were things of history. We thought that these were things that we had actually defeated. Many of us didn't suspect that there would be a return to these things. So the book really explains, how is this happening? Where did these ideas come from? How have they kind of become weaponized? How have they evolved, changed, and essentially moved from the fringe into the centers of power, not just in the United States, but across Western Europe, and are now endangering the heartlands of liberal democracies. And there's a whole global network now. The term I coined, alt-right, obviously channels the energy of the Nazis and kind of highlights that there is a very dangerous white supremacist eugenics component to this resurfacing ideology, but also that it's not the same. It's different, it's new, it's alt. Kind of playing with the term alt-right, which is a lot more well known, the idea of an alternative right, which is how they attempted to essentially, people in the movement deliberately attempted, people around Steve Bannon and elsewhere, wanted to reframe the far right and kind of make it more palatable and more acceptable for the everyday.
It's maybe worth explaining. A brief tour, you must read the book, everybody, is one of the vectors of this return of Nazi fascist ideology was the Pioneer Fund. A lot of the sort of influence, the spreads are through eugenics and sort of false science and things like that. And if I was going to sum it up for somebody who doesn't know, doesn't understand, who may like movies, right? It's a bit like um, Lord of the Rings. Sauron gets defeated sort of early on, I think, 2,000 years beforehand, and then is slowly reconstituted via the ring and comes back. And it's like a lot of those ideas, which, are not explicitly about Lebensraum anymore, not explicitly necessarily about Jews, a lot about Black people, a lot about Muslims, are being reformatted in a sort of laundered way. And so it may be worth, therefore, charting the progress of these last 4 months of the Trump administration. I'm not sure anybody would be quite as surprised if they'd read your book, though. Is it genuine? Are you taken back by the speed of it? But one of the first indicators, wasn't it, was the Smithsonian Institute saying, basically say you're not allowed to talk about race. Basically saying race does exist as a construct, as an actual thing.
Yeah, so I mean, it is quite surprising, when I, even when when we wrote the book, we put the book together. I think there was a sense of this, that we've moved into a new phase, that we've actually passed an inflection point, and there is actually now a direct assault on the very foundations of democracy. And this is now almost becoming open. So you've got this point where people who are directly connected and influencing the Trump administration have been openly calling for the end of democracy,
Mm.
and not just in a negative sense. They in a positive sense, and they have a vision of a very different type of world. And some of the thinkers around this movement have talked about that. So I think I've been surprised um, by the fact that some of the things that have been described in the book are actually happening in the way, because when you write
In
something
months.
in theory, or you write something in text, you
Mm.
kind of think, yeah, this is insane. Is this really going to happen? And
You're
then,
trying to warn. You're trying to stop it happening, aren't you?
yeah, exactly. You write something like this so that it doesn't happen, so that people take notice. So when you actually see it happening, it is quite frightening, quite disheartening, especially when you know what the thinking behind it is. And I think, earlier this year, what you referred to, Peter, was a series of executive orders which have gone under the radar. There's been a number of major executive orders which haven't received barely any news coverage at all. And these have touched on issues. So some of the ones that did receive a lot of attention were around civil rights, and obviously the major assault on civil rights, which anyone could say, oh, why is there an assault on civil rights? After like half a century of success, about moving away from segregation, and that's why we had civil rights, to get away from a racist past. So what's the problem with it? So that was quite strange. But then there was quite direct references in some of that legislation to segregation, and to the so one of the strange things that happened is that the government said that there is no longer a ban on federal contractors who basically engage in segregation in the services they provide. And this is a weird thing to do in an executive order, because as many commentators observed, is in because they didn't actually change civil rights law, they can't implement that. So they can't actually make people kind of have segregation and things like that. But so the question was, why then would you have an executive order which puts this in there, even though it's not really something that can be enforced? Like if a federal contractor comes along and says, well, we want to segregate our services, then the existing legislation would still prevent them from doing that, even though the Trump order says, well, we've removed a ban on that. So many people said it's a strange kind of moral kind of victory for them to be able to say that. And then they went further. There was an executive order specifically targeting the Smithsonian Institute. And this was how we see the rewriting of history, where it complained about um, historical institutions in the United States being attacked, and it complained about essentially kind of um, it used language around activists who are essentially supposedly rewriting history. What they were complaining about was the recent efforts over many years, uh, you know, to essentially call out the reality of the impact of racial segregation, colonialism, and as such, and white supremacist ideologies and slavery on the history of the United States. And so the Smithsonian Institution was specifically targeted in the order, and the order complained that the Smithsonian Institution had an educational exhibit talking about eugenics and scientific racism, and they complained that why are they saying that race is a construct? That's, you
Which it
shouldn't do
is,
that.
which we know, so they're directly, like they are in other areas like coronavirus and vaccines, directly interfering in the science, trying to write it. And you say these executive orders could be challenged in the courts, but as we're seeing, the courts are slow. They are enjoying abrogating some of these court orders. So it is it's the will to power, isn't it, over law and order. This is a kind of, they're making these statements. I've noticed a lot of sackings, any mention of DEI, any really senior in the military, people of color, they are being removed. They're being culled. It's a purge.
That's right. It's happening. And I think we can see now when we start looking at they've been very careful about it. They've been quite clever. So while passing these executive orders, and they've not been really scrutinized by the press, and it kind of reveals that, wait a minute, you're saying race is not a construct. You're complaining about criticisms of scientific racism. Why does this matter to you? What's going
unless
on?
unless
Unless,
you believe.
unless there's an underlying kind of ideology, a very deeply racist eugenicist ideology which is at play. Um, what's also interesting is when you're looking at, for instance, the crackdown on migrants and this kind of the ICE detention centers and the targeting of Venezuelans, for instance, it's now been absolutely well documented that the whole thing is a farce. That they're not actually targeting criminals. All of the claims that they've made that, oh, we're using tattoos which link to criminal gangs, and we've had all the evidence showing that the gangs in question do not identify with tattoos.
Yeah.
This is just a fact. So
And one
all
had
of
an
these,
autism awareness tattoo, the famous, Abega, he's for. So this is performative. This
it's
is
performative, yes, and I think that's very significant because when you realize that actually what they're doing is there is kind of a deliberate institutionalization of the lying, and where you're saying that where you're actually targeting people because of their race.
yeah,
You're targeting them because they're Venezuelan and they're migrants and they're here. And you're using the spectre of criminality to justify it. And you're just kind of creating this. It's got a mimetic quality to it, where you're just pummeling people with this association that, oh, they wear tattoos, they're like this, they're criminals, they're Venezuelan, they're unlawful, they're a drain on the country, and it's all packaged into one. And then when people are challenging it, obviously there is a. We've already seen the Supreme Court has condemned and declared things that Trump is doing as illegal, and then Trump has said, "Well, doesn't really matter to me, really." And that really highlights what's at play here. That the extraordinary thing about some of these executive orders is that one of them actually lays out the strategy, and it says that the only people who in the US government are considered by the government to be appropriate to interpret the law is President Trump and his attorney general. And who they decide. So it's a complete shift of
mm,
power. And what they're saying is they're saying it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says.
mm,
It doesn't matter what local court says. What matters is what Trump says and what his advisors say, and we are the law. So this is a really fundamental shift. And I think
yeah,
many people don't quite grasp the significance of that because once you've shifted that ground and you've said, well, actually, the law isn't about checks and balances, the law is just what Trump says it is and his people say it is.
mhm.
That's fascism.
Yes,
That is fascism
definitely.
pure.
Yeah. And the enabling acts, obviously, the famous enabling acts in the Nazi journey, basically said the will to survival, the will to power, of the Führer, of the leader, is bigger than anything else. Before we, because I do want to go onto a teal, and I want to go onto the Boer genocide, because it's a living example from this week. And we should catch up regularly, Nafeez, because there's going to be plenty of other living examples, I fear, in the weeks and months ahead. But when we look back at what Trump has done in those first, he says, if Trump says, I'm not going to play the law, right? I ignore it. Who can enforce the law against him? Because he controls the FBI. Obviously, you have states, police, other. And it does, I don't know how you feel, but being a Brit and seeing the creaky, archaic, medieval system we have here, no prime minister could do this kind of stuff, could they? The powers the president has, if the Supreme Court says he's immune to prosecution, seem to be ungainsayable. I mean, who can stop Trump deporting more people, even though it's unlawful? What's the mechanism?
Well, I think that's the dangerous territory that we're moving into now. Is
Mm,
that right now there is a potential scope to counteract if we make the right choices. By that, of course, if the Democrats mobilize, if the opposition mobilizes, if people mobilize, if civil society mobilizes, there is still that the administration is kind of caught with this. There's a driving kind of ideology which is we want to centralize power, centralize lawmaking, and that's driven by this kind of new ideology that's kind of taken hold of the White House,
Mm.
which is, like you said, it's about the will to power. It's about almost seeing Trump as a kind of monarchical figure. Um, that is also complicated by the fact that there are multiple interests and they're very incoherent who are driving this. The Republicans are not all unified. I think many of them are kind of aligned behind this because they know it's the direction of travel, but a lot of people aren't comfortable with it. They don't necessarily like that. A lot of Republicans find it odd. They don't really know the bigger. They don't know that they're not sure they buy into all of the things that different sectors are doing. They don't necessarily agree with everything Elon Musk is doing. They don't necessarily like the Silicon Valley ideology. They're not really sure about all of that. So
Yeah.
there is a potential there to fracture that kind of apparent unity of purpose and to push back hard, because some people are doing that. We do have states fighting back. There are courts fighting back. There are judges who are speaking out with their rulings, and those are being enforced. So there is a tussle. But we're also seeing that the administration, where it can, is is demonstrating its contempt for
Mm.
the law. So sometimes they're complying and sometimes they're not, and it's quite, again, it's not coherent. So I think within that there is scope to push back.
But
However, that window of opportunity is there's an effort to close that window,
I,
and that's what's really alarming.
I'd like to get on this sort of weird to the tech bros and the dark enlightenment just in a moment, but just to go back to that. So obviously, there's a strand in republicanism for the last 40 years, maybe longer. States' rights. They're always going on about federal government bad, states' rights. This is federal government doing a lot of this. Um, what is the mechanism though? If somebody is deported on a plane by federal, federal forces, if you like, who, even if the courts say that's illegal, don't do that. And maybe you don't know. Maybe one of our some of our listeners, our viewers, might know this. What does the state do? Call out the National Guard? I mean, it just seems that central power, in a way, I've always thought there's a right wing fear about you because federal government was a lot behind sort of social spending. They seemed to be more liberal. They'd broke down segregation, enforced civil rights. But at this point, you are slightly, wondering, it has an amazing one office can change all these executive orders, take over, take over the Lincoln Arts Centre, just get rid of everybody in a way which I find quite conceivable. I can't imagine, Keir Starmer getting rid of the head of BBC or the head of British Museum. Has that shocked you? And do we actually know what the physical process is for those states to object to these federal manoeuvres?
Well, I think this is the thing. What we've seen, what's really frightening about what has been done by, in terms of, for instance, the migrant expulsions and the mass detentions. What's extraordinary about that is the sheer impunity of it,
Mm,
and the fact, exactly as you said, what is the recourse? And we've seen that there are perfectly innocent people that, as high up as the Supreme Court has said this is wrong, and nothing can be done. There are no forms of recourse. And that's extraordinary. And I think before this situation, no one would have expected that. We all would have thought that there are some strong, robust checks and balances in a democracy that prevent this sort of absolute unilateral grab of power. And I think that's the situation we're in. And I think this is an alarm bell for us in the UK and in Europe to recognize the vulnerability of our democracies. That just because we can't imagine it happening, the real reason it's not happening is because that will to power is not there.
yeah.
Thank God Keir Starmer is not wanting to unilaterally take over everything.
Mm,
If we do have a political figure coming in to power in Britain who has very similar Trumpist ambitions, we don't know. It's an unknown situation. How strong is the British,
yeah.
constitution? We don't know. It's untested ground. We can hope that that kind of thing can't be done here. But I think the lesson to learn here is that when there is a will, when there is a very strong will, and a very weakened opposition, those conditions can make the erosion of democracy much easier. Um, and it does worry me. For instance, the things that worry me are in the UK, just while we're on the topic, we do have some extraordinary draconian legislation,
Yeah,
which
on
is kind of
protests.
sitting there dormant to some extent,
Mm,
which can be mobilized to do really, really crazy things. I mean, like the Civil Contingencies Act,
mm,
which was passed like in 2004, which is kind of ancient times for us these days. But that was, a piece of legislation that was about dealing with major national emergencies and the extraordinary powers that a government might need in those times. But, those powers are extraordinary. Like a government could set up military courts,
mm.
they could grab a huge amount of executive power and minimize the ability of the press to kind of respond. Um, stop freedom of association. There's a lot of things that could be done under British legislation that I think, if you had a pretext, you could do that, and it would make it very difficult to challenge that in courts. So this is something that we need to bear in mind.
So these are warnings for us across the earth. What happens? Just briefly, you mentioned there are forces figures here who quite admire Trump. Well, we know who you're talking about. We're talking Nigel Farage, and I think I can't remember which council. Maybe you can. The first thing they did was ban sort of any cover of climate change, any officers or DEI, whatever our equivalent to that is. And it's all very symbolic, but that people don't. Musk and Trump are wildly reviled in the UK, and yet somehow people are voting for its lookalike. It's the biggest appetite. That's right. We haven't got long, Nafeez, so I wanted to get to the Boer genocide, and we can go there via um, two figures from South Africa who figure very much in your oligarchy category, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. Um, you write brilliantly and wrote recently about the Dark Enlightenment and Curtis Yarving, who's the clear figure from that, isn't it? Thanks for getting that feedback, whatever that is. And yeah, so just explain a little bit Dark Enlightenment, where that sits with Peter Thiel, uh, founder of Palantir, founder of PayPal, Elon Musk, who needs no introduction, and how in the last week their particular South African inverted form of racism, which is there's been a genocide against the Boers, played out in the White House.
Well, it's quite extraordinary to see those scenes, when we had the president of South Africa being confronted with which, in a couple of hours later, was exposed as just blatant lies and disinformation. Had nothing to do with South Africa. Those images that he was challenged with, and that really kind of highlights what we're seeing here. That there is a narrative, a racist narrative, which came from, kind of has been promoted by sympathizers of apartheid to this day, and was presented at the White House. Now, Elon Musk actually, people keep, he parades himself as I'm anti-apartheid and all this stuff, but he actually, as I mentioned in the book, he's a paid subscriber to an X account,
Mm.
which is a Boer disinformation account, which has been promoting this kind of white genocide disinformation. It regularly promotes racist and eugenics content, and Elon Musk retweets it, and he's paying this account, paying this person to put this stuff out. So this kind of sympathy with apartheid was actually there for anyone who wanted to have a look. Anyone with eyes to see, you could see that actually this was always there. But it harks back to much deeper, insidious ideas. Um, and this idea of the Dark Enlightenment, which I explain at length in the book, has been kind of formulated by a number of these kind of tech bro bloggers that people like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel from Palantir, David Sachs from PayPal, all these guys were mates, and even other tech bros like Mark Andreessen, and several other kind of very powerful individuals in the Trump administration were reading this writing. And one of the key writers, there were two kind of key individuals, but I think the guy who really popularized it was Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin he is a kind of a tech bro light. Like he's not a massively successful entrepreneur, but he received funding from Peter Thiel, and he had Peter Thiel's ear. He was became his friend. They would talk often, and he wrote this blog under a first under a pseudonym, and then later became a lot more open about it and revealed his identity, and built up quite a large following in that kind of tech bro land. And he would essentially, when you look at his writing, you can see the influence of his ideas across Trump's policies, and it's quite extraordinary because people like J.D. Vance, the VP, have spoken about Curtis Yarvin and his work. Several other people who are in the Trump administration, administration officials, uh, have read his work and are inspired by his work. And he even turned up to Trump's inauguration and all the rest of it. So his hand on some of these ideas is actually directly visible. And so it's extraordinary to see. And I think I found this particularly perturbing, that I'm the only journalist and Byline Times is the only publication, because many people have written about Curtis Yarvin recently, and they've recognized that he had advocated, as I said before, this very insidious vision of ending democracy. And his vision was essentially replace democracy with a Silicon Valley style kind of startup mode where you have the autocracy of the CEO because that's super efficient. But it went further than that. And he was like, what we should do is have a patchwork of entities. Smash national governments and end national borders and just create a patchwork of mini sovereign territories where residents have no say and it's entirely controlled by the kind of the sovereign individual, and that was, and his ideas very chimed very much with work by William Rees-Mogg, who is Jacob Rees-Mogg's dad, who wrote a similar book called The Sovereign Individual, and they reached this very similar vision of how to break up national democracies and national governments. But what was at the root of this idea, and this is what we revealed, and no one's talking about this, by the way, which is very weird, is that about 15 years ago, it was 2008, 2009, Curtis Yarvin wrote a number of articles about race and eugenics, which are absolutely shocking. And they really kind of identify the core of what is the driving force of this opposition to democracy. So he complained about what he called the American. I apologize for my language in advance, but I'm just going to quote him verbatim. He called it the American Negro problem. And he basically opined at length on the inferiority of the black race, as he described it, and the problem of having left the era of segregation, which he actually kind of landed lots of praise on. So this his lives for American black people, he said, were much better under segregation, and then moved into this kind of exposition of how, having given freedom and rights to black people, their conditions in their lives have dramatically deteriorated. And he then extends this idea, and he refers to a number of racial eugenics concepts quite openly. So, very traditional racist eugenics concept, the idea that there is essentially a biological hierarchy of human beings, black people at the bottom, white people are basically at the top, and there is this biologically determined IQ differentiation, and that determines everything in society. And the other kind of thing that was very important to mention here is that he basically demonizes the global majority. So he talks about this danger of an extinction of the white race. And what's really crazy when he does this is that and I think maybe the reason why journalists didn't pick up on it is that he doesn't use the terms white and black.
Mm.
He actually says we're going to refer to these categories of population using these terminologies, and he uses these other words that he comes up with, like the Brahmin and other kind of caste language, and then he includes links, and then when you go to the links, then you can kind of see that, oh, he's talking about black people, he's talking about white people, he's talking about these types of groups. So he uses code. to get that across. But then when you read it, it's basically saying he's worried that black and brown people, due to democracy, and the masses will essentially rise up, and because they're inferior, they will essentially conquer the white race, take over everything, and destroy everything. So the only solution is to eliminate democracy, and that's how we get from this very strange eugenics kind of thinking to this ideology of we have to destroy democracy because democracy is like this existential risk to humanity. So you begin to see, why is it that people like Elon Musk keep talking about and positioning themselves as defenders of humanity, and and all of this stuff, and then it kind of obviously vibes with a lot of the other techno utopian kind of fantasies that they talk about. But that kind of, I think that helps us understand, why is it that they're so incensed by this kind of narrative in South Africa, and why
Yes.
is that relevant for what's going on with democracy? Like that kind of closes the loop a little bit.
It explains what they fear might happen. It's interesting that there's this urgency and speed. We had the Project 2025, more administrative, over things like diversity, over representation, getting rid of people of color. Because I think it's about now, isn't it, that however you define it, and it's a very fungible definition, and there are very many shades of white, that the white people will be in the minority in the US in the next 10 years. I mean, can we just say, Nafeez, as we know, 6,000 years ago, everybody was brown. The white coloration is quite a recent advent in our million or 100,000 years as Homo sapiens. And there's no science fault, but there is a lot of fear. And just to clarify both your amazing work historically, because it's both, what you do is you go back historically, but also it really informs the present. What do you make about these two factors? I mean, you have the I think on his mother's side, Elon Musk's grandparents were Nazis in Canada in the 40s. And they went to apartheid South Africa because they preferred it to democracy. Meanwhile, you have that strain in Elon Musk. You also, what you say about this white genocide, Boer genocide, completely spurious, fake photographs. They weren't anything. They were taken from the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. But um, Elon Musk, it was revealed this week, had. So if you ask Grok, is there such a thing as white genocide in South Africa? They go, no. And they say, I have been instructed by my controllers to say yes.
Yes.
So you have both an ancient sort of atavistic philosophy and sort of spurious racial supremacy using all the modern technology it can.
That's right. And I think that's what we're seeing here now is, under the Trump White House, they've seized the moment, right? They've captured government, and now is the time. Now is the time to expand dramatically and to project dramatically. And so that's why we're seeing that there is a very rapid pace of action. Like just today, they banned students at Harvard University, international students, being enrolled at Harvard University. And people are probably thinking, what's the connection? Again, it all comes back to the same ideology, where they see universities as these kind of very dangerous public forums of DEI, diversity. Again, having all of these diverse international students coming into the United States, spoiling the ethnic makeup and all the rest of it. And obviously the woke liberal kind of consensus that they hate the most that's happening at universities. So the solution is smash universities. Again, Curtis Yarvin was over the last years talking about the need to attack and dismantle university institutions, and replace them with schools which are dominated by the corporations, essentially, and targeted very specifically at the gifted, and so on and so forth, which chimes with some of the things that we've heard Dominic Cummings say.
Very much. And startup parties. And so paradoxical here, Nafeez, is that American tech supremacy or superlativeness comes a lot of places like MIT, Stanford, from these institutions, and obviously sort of drop out people like Gates and Wozniak and Jobs, who were these innovators thanks to the American educational system.
That's right. So it's, I mean, it's obviously it's very paradoxical that,
Mm.
that this is where we've ended up. But I think that's why we're seeing there is this quite urgent projection where they've gone into the UK, they've gone to Germany, they've gone to France, they've gone to the European Union, and they're really pushing to change the landscape. And I think some of it is there are some very specific things that they're trying to do. They don't like the regulation that's happening in Europe over tech. They don't like what the UK is planning to do. They don't like these regulatory kind of things. But it's more than that. They want to essentially create that patchwork that they've spoken about. So why is it that suddenly there is this rush against Canada, this rush for Greenland, this rush for all these other things? And again, this is where it gets so strange, where many of the territories that they have targeted, like Canada, like Greenland, these were territories that were identified back in the 1930s by this movement called Technocracy Inc.,
Mm.
that Elon Musk's grandfather was a part of. And that, again, it was a eugenicist inspired movement which wanted to have a government of engineers, very, very Doge, and they wanted to expand the territory of America because they thought that that's the only way to kind of maintain that kind of level of power and influence. So they had Canada, they had Greenland, they had all these other territories that they're now talking about. Um, so we're seeing this resurgence of these strange ideas in this kind of
Mm.
weird, incoherent way. But I think here in the UK and in Europe, I think we need to recognize, and I think this is really the theme of the book, which is this is not just kind of radical extremism, or this is not even just it's the fringe far right become mainstream. This is something else entirely. This is something quite new. It's a new form of fascism. We don't have the name for it, and it has a very urgent agenda, which is to remake the entire Western world in its image because they believe that if they don't do that, that the white race is going to go extinct. For them, it's an existential war, and it's very much a war. And I think that's why we need to kind of think, well, wait a minute, where are the lines of influence here in the UK? Where are the lines of influence in Europe? And really surface those because people, as I think, as we when we started this conversation, you pointed out, Peter, that people don't like Trump and Elon Musk here, but yet they're voting for Farage. So they haven't made that connection. The media has done a great disservice by not making clear who is Nigel Farage, what does he stand for? Is he just a puppet?
So the great thing is, Nafeez, you fulfill a lot of that service, particularly in your book and your writings for us. So I'm sure you'll have some more information, maybe about certain influences, Peter Thiel, in the UK. But meantime, I think we should regularly update this conversation because you give a great perspective of all these things that seem to be happening randomly. They're not. I apologize to all our viewers and listeners if there's a bit of distortion. I don't know if it's just my end. We'll see if we can work that out for next time. But meanwhile, Nafeez, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks to everybody for watching. This will soon go out on Byline Supplement with a link to the book, which is a must read. And probably you'll need a third edition soon, Nafeez.
We're never ending, isn't it, at this stage?
Thanks for joining us, Nafeez, and goodbye, everybody. Thanks for
Thanks,
watching.
thanks everyone. Cheers.